share his reflection today.
Let us pray. Be present among us, Jesus Christ, the eternal Word, and speak to us today through your life-giving words. Amen. Dear brothers and sisters, it's a joy to be back in your midst today. I'm hoping at some point we will have the slides of the PowerPoint on the screen. As we keep reflecting about the theme, shunning violence and nurturing peace, what comes to mind when you think about shunning violence? How do we shun violence in our day-to-day lives? How do we shun the violence that leads to structural sin? I think the slide should be up on the screen in a few minutes. But when we speak about shunning violence, somebody once pointed out that we seem to live in a world where there just seems to be enough religion to make us hate one another, but not enough religion to make us love one another. We seem to live in a world where there seems to be enough religion that makes us hate one another, but not enough religion that makes us love one another. If we reflect upon this, we see that there is a poignant truth to this statement. And this is something that can be extended to all religions. In fact, Wesley Arayaraja, who, as a theologian from Sri Lanka, who several years ago served the World Council of Churches as the director for their interfaith program, once said that religion is guilty of perpetuating violence in different forms, be it violence against the religious other, or even complicity with other violences that we are more habituated with. The violence of patriarchy, the violence of caste system, the violence of other forms of xenophobia. Next. Oops, there's no screen. Yeah. So there is no denying that looking at the world around us, that we live in a world that can be described as being scandalous. The Accra Confession, which some of you may have read in your introduction to church history, a confession of the Reformed churches, says we live in a scandalous world that denies God's call to life for all. Let's reflect a bit on what is happening around the world around us. There is the denial of God's call of life for all in various forms. And religion sometimes becomes complicit with this denial of life. Next. And in some ways, often our faith and even our theology can provide what the Palestinian Lutheran theologian, Mithri Raheb, calls the software for hate, war, and violence. On one hand, in context of conflict, we have the hardware of missiles, we have the hardware of weaponry, but sometimes what drives people into violence is also the software of hate, our theology and our faith itself. Next, the Jewish theologian Jonathan Sachs, in his book, Not in My Name, makes this powerful observation about the potential of religion to turn violent when it is misused. And he says this, and I quote, he says, "Too often in the history of religion, people have killed in the name of the God of life, waged war in the name of the God of peace, hated in the name of the God of love, and practiced cruelty in the name of the God of compassion." And he goes on to write this. He says, "When this happens, God speaks, sometimes in a still, small voice, almost inaudible, beneath the clamor of those claiming to speak on God's behalf. What God says at such a time is, 'Not in my name.'" And that is the title of his book, "Not in my name." Do not perpetuate violence in my name. There is a powerful truth to this quote, because very often we abuse God's name consistently for funding our own propensity for war and violence. And today I want to just focus on one element of shunning violence, which is shunning the sin of complicity with violence through apathy and silence. Because very often war, violence, conflict are sustained because of the silence of the majority among us, who refuse to speak out, who refuse to act in decisive ways. And very often we become captive to what can be called the sin of neutrality. We claim to be neutral in situations of injustice. We say this has got nothing to do with my theology, and refuse to get our hands tainted. Next. Some of you may be familiar with this quote by the former Archbishop of Cape Town, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He contests the notion, the myth of neutrality that many people, many Christians, seem to embrace in situations when the Christian voice counts. And he says, if we are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse, and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. Dear brothers and sisters, there are times in our lives when we need to take the risk of saying things that will make us unpopular, of doing things in a way which will refuse to be somewhere caught in the middle of conflict, but take sides with the vulnerable. And today I want to focus on one of the most shameful and probably tragic impediments for peace in a world of injustice, which is the sin of silence. And I want to focus especially on those who, despite having the power and the influence to bring about justice, to bring about peace, have actually become complicit in violence by remaining silent. And we see that across the world, how many times political leaders, church leaders, often opt for the option of silence when what is needed is a courageous and a compassionate moral voice. And from the reading that was read to us, I want to focus on one character from the biblical story who can actually teach us to overcome the sin of silence and take a witness which is shaped as solidarity. Next. So I want you to introduce what I call the hero of our biblical story. So there is, if you look at the reading from Exodus chapter 2, there is one character in this text who refuses to be complicit in this sin of silence and seeks to defy power in a positive way to make a difference. And you might have guessed by now that the person that I would like to focus on is Pharaoh's daughter, who rescues Moses from genocide, the genocide that was dictated and ordered by her own father. And in doing so, she comes across as somebody who defies the decree of her own father, Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt. As is the pattern in many stories of women in the Bible, our character also is somebody who remains unnamed. There is no name that is given for Pharaoh's daughter. However, if you look at the Bible, there are a different set of indicators that we find for the identity of the three main characters in the story. They are identified by their ethnicity. In this story, we find, first of all, a man who is described as coming from the house of Levi, who is married to a woman who is identified as a daughter of Levi. And these are the parents of Moses. And also mentioned in this story is somebody who just has the title, the daughter of Pharaoh, who saves Moses. No names for any of them. And in some ways, this emphasis on lineage to identify our main characters highlights the point that the one who is responsible for nurturing the future leader of a community that is not hers is not from the same lineage as the abandoned child, but is the daughter of Pharaoh, an essential other in the biblical narrative. And when we look at the story, this is a story where through compassion and through courage, strict and significant boundaries are breached. But I said that this is somebody who appears to not have a name. Though, next, in the biblical tradition itself, this character may not have a name. In the Jewish tradition, Jewish scholars have often given her a name. She's named as Bitya, a little bit similar to the Hindi Bitya. And this literally means daughter of God. In a Jewish text called the Leviticus Rabbah, we see God, the Holy One, giving her this name. And God says to Bitya, the daughter of Pharaoh, and this is how the text goes, God says, Moses was not your son, yet you called him your son. You are not my daughter, but I will call you my daughter. For somebody who is considered to be outside the ethnicity, this is a profound and a powerful statement. And therefore, we find in this tradition, God giving her a name that is Bitya. Next. And today I was reflecting on why do we choose her for our reflection today. And because if we pause for a minute and reflect on the context in which Bitya carried her decisive action of saving Moses, we find that there is something prophetic about what she does. Let us pause for a minute and look at this second chapter from the book of Exodus, or even the chapter that precedes it, the first chapter. Here, we are introduced to a political context where Bitya's father, the Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, he has successfully sold the potent weapon of phasis, which is the fear of the other. He has sold this weapon to his community. He says, if we let the Israelites live among us, they will outnumber us. They will become more powerful. And we see this narrative being perpetuated and enacted even today in different contexts, where the majority actually has this manufactured myth of the fear of the minority. They say that minorities can become dangerous. And this is something that has fueled that is fueling ethno-nationalists across the world, not only in South Asia, but also in parts of Europe, where the fear of the other is constantly being invoked by our politicians and our leaders, and actually translated into violence against the minorities and the marginalized communities. So we see here the Pharaoh, the emperor, the ruler of Egyptians, actually selling this potent weapon of phasis, which is the fear of the other, to his own people. And we also see that the language of security and safety is invoked to justify the oppression and even the ethnic cleansing of a section of the people. So what is the result of this fear? Cleanse the Israelites, make them slaves, give them more labor, and if possible, kill their firstborn, so that there is effectively genocide. And Pharaoh says, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them. The language of being shrewd, just be wise. It is not the language of hatred. It is not the language of violence. It says, just be smart, just be shrewd, because in the future there is danger. And we see that even being invoked in our country today, that just be, what is that? The majority are in danger. So just be a little bit smart, because in the future the others may overtake us. And therefore what happens is, in this biblical story, is a systemic oppression is started. And there is economic exploitation, which culminates in what can be called a full-fledged, state-sponsored genocide, which orders the death of newborn Hebrew boys. There is a full-fledged, a state-sponsored genocide, which is still the norm today in many countries across the world, where people seek to control, to contain people who are vulnerable. We also see at the same time that there is distortion of history. And if we pause for a minute and pay attention to the story, we see that what is at work is what can be called a whole xenophobia industry, which mobilizes hatred against the other. There is an industry of xenophobia, where false propaganda, where all the powers of the state are being used, economic oppression are all being used to mobilize and weaponize hatred against the other. So it also starts with the distortion of history. And if we read the biblical passage, it seems a little bit strange that the new Pharaoh did not know Joseph. And this is strange because this is a kingdom that is actually built on the achievements of Joseph. Joseph was the one who actually built the kingdom for Pharaoh. You remember the story of the famine, where Joseph actually helped the country of Egypt to thrive in the midst of challenging circumstances. So it was on his achievements that this whole empire was built. And yet, it seems strange that the new Pharaoh did not know Joseph. It says that the new Pharaoh did not know Joseph. And that is a pattern, the erasure of history, the erasure of the contributions of the other is very much a pattern of the violent regimes that rule our world today. And very often, even in many contexts of rising nationalism, of religious violence, we find people being constantly blotted out from our histories. There are projects to rewrite histories in a way which will make the other, the religious minority, the enemy of the majority. And therefore, the space that these people had in history is constantly a space that is deliberately made to shrink. They are made invisible and irrelevant. And therefore, we attempts to revive history. If you look at the global thing, there is Black History Month. Can you have the next slide, please? We have Black History Month in India and across the globe. We have also introduced the Dalit History Month, and there are special occasions to remember the contributions of the Adivasis, the indigenous people, even in our church calendars, because sometimes there is this danger that people's contributions, their gifts, their achievements are constantly rendered invisible by those in power. Next. So as I said, a new narrative of fear is introduced. And we have this resonance of these narratives of fear of the other in the nationalisms of today. The nationalisms of today are no longer about geopolitical landscapes. They're also, so to speak, about landscapes of the mind. There are these landscapes of the minds whose borders are being drawn and redrawn with hostility, with fear, to suit vested political agendas. Next. And in this story, we also find that economics becomes an ally of xenophobia. We find that the Hebrew people are reduced to slaves. Economy is made a means of oppression. The slaves are used to build cities, supply cities, what they call supply cities. And the fact that economy and xenophobia are linked is also something that our long histories of oppression and discrimination attest to. A few years ago, the World Council of Churches organized its mission conference in Tanzania. It came up with what it called the Arusha Call to Discipleship. And in this call to discipleship, it recognized how economics and xenophobia work together in dividing communities, discriminating people, and damaging the earth. Next. So the Arusha Call to Discipleship has this to say about the imperial system. It says, this global imperial system has made the financial market one of the idols of our time. It has also cultures of domination and discrimination that continue to marginalize and exclude millions, forcing some of us into conditions of vulnerability and exploitation. And we live in a context where there is this unholy alliance between economics and religion. When we speak and focus on nationalisms, we tend to separate the economic side of nationalism. But today, when we look at the Indian context, nationalism is fueled by economic interests. And this unholy alliance between nationalism and the corporate global project is brought about perceptively not by a theologian, but by the Indian author Arundhati Roy. And she makes a fascinating connection between nationalism and the global corporate project. And this is what she says. Next. She says, nationalism has long been part of the corporate global project. The freer global capital becomes, the harder national borders become. So people are not allowed to cross boundaries. Colonialism needed to move large populations of people, slaves and indentured labor, to work in mines and on plantations. Now, the new dispensation needs to keep people in place and move the money. So all those call centers, everything that is burgeoning up in India as part of the national corporate, the global corporate projects. So the new formula is free capital. Money can move across the world, but caged labor, but people can't move. So we become labor factories. How else are you going to drive down wages and increase profit margins? profit is the only constant, and it has worked to a point. So the reification of boundaries, the lack of freedom for people to move, and the increased emphasis on labor factories across the world is a way in which nationalism is also fueled. As you look at our church, as you look at our social analysis and other courses, this is something for us to reflect upon. How do economics and the industry of hate and violence go hand in hand? And also, if we pay attention to the story, we see that there is the weaponizing of the instruments of life into means of death. There is the weaponizing of the instruments of life into the means of death. Let us look at the river Nile. What is the river Nile used for? It becomes a weapon in genocide because it becomes the place where the newborn Hebrew children are to be drowned. So Nile, the river Nile, which was a source of life, which was a life-giving source of fresh water for agriculture, for livelihood, now is made into something else which is sinister, which is violent. And very often that is also what happens. Means, blessings from God, our natural resources, our money, our financial resources, are often converted into weapons of death rather than the means of life. And also the other thing that we find is the Hebrew midwives, who are also instruments of life, are actually asked to become means of death. What are they asked to do? They are asked to kill their own people. They are asked to kill their own people. And that is also how regimes turn against our own species. Our own humanity becomes humanity's worst enemy. And instead of nurturing life together, instead of nurturing peaceful coexistence together, we are portrayed as enemies to each other. We are portrayed as if our own existence is based on the extermination of the other. Only if we kill can we have life. And that is the story and the pressure of the Hebrew midwives. They are made to kill their own people. Next. So, but even in the midst of this death-dealing story, there is hope, because we find that there is a solidarity of life that is forged in the midst of death. What happens if you pay attention to the story? The Hebrew midwives, they gently, silently, in their own way, refuse to succumb to the orders of the empire. They practice defiance and resistance in a hidden way. Subtle acts of resistance. And James Scott, some of you may be familiar with the work of James Scott. He speaks about disguised defiance of the marginalized communities. He speaks about the weapons of the weak. Very often, people who are in vulnerable situations, they do not resist openly, but there are hidden ways in which people resist. Because if we resist openly, then it will be repressed by the powerful. And therefore, there are hidden ways in which people resist. There are hidden ways in which they live prophetic existences. And even if you look in your own context, in your states, in your cultures, in your own churches, you will often find these people among us. The ones who practice this disguised defiance of the powers that be. Defiance which will lead to life. And it is in this context next that defiance begins from home. So, and this defiance is initiated by none else but the daughter of the emperor, the Pharaoh herself, the daughter of Pharaoh. Bithia is the one who defies the orders of her own father. So defiance begins from home. She does not participate in the killing of this Hebrew child. She knows that this is the child of her Hebrew parents, but she chooses to act with compassion. And this is a compassion which is not just momentary, but is sustained. So, and what we find about Bithia's action is something that is truly challenging and prophetic. Because she is acting in the midst of a narrative that privileges and protects her own safety. her own identity, but still she chooses to act for the other, with Moses' mother and her sister. And she refuses to be part of the power games of an oppressive system, which is epitomized by her own father. She refuses to be part of this power games. And she does not wait for others to do something. She takes the initiative and does something which is radical. Next. Some of you may be familiar with this quote, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And somebody once said, in today's world, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it does not naturally bend towards justice, because of the leaders that we have, the politicians that we have, are not geared towards justice. So we may have to bend that moral arc ourselves so that it points towards justice. There is work to be done. And in that sense, the actions of Bitya are sustained. Nurturing peace, I like the way in which you have spoken about not peace building or peacemaking as if it's a construction project, but you have spoken about it in terms of nurturing, something that is gently nurtured, that will give rise to life. And this nurturing means that there is need for sustained efforts. Peace does not just come on its own. That these actions need to be sustained, that we are in for a long time. And in many ways, solidarity in the face of violence and conflict is about sustaining our actions. It is not momentary phases of heroism, but how do we sustain ourselves in these actions of nurturing peace? Next. So some of you may be familiar with the anthropologist by name Mary Mead. Many years ago, she was a famous anthropologist who had studied different cultural contexts and different types of people. Many years ago, she was in a classroom and she was asked by a student what she considered to be the first sign of civilization in a culture. And many of her students expected her to say something extraordinary. They wanted her to say, they were thinking whether she would mention hunting tools which helped human beings to survive, or even cooking utensils or fire, or some people thought that she would say something spiritual or religious. And in fact, what Margaret Mead said was something which was really profound. She pointed to a picture, and this was the picture of a healed, fractured femur. Femur, as you know, is the longest bone in the human body, the bone that connects the midriff with the legs, the thigh bone. She pointed to a healed, fractured femur, which was a 15,000-year-old bone found in an archaeological site. And she said this bone, the longest one in the body, which is broken but yet healed, is the oldest sign of human civilization. Because she went on to say, in the natural world, if somebody's femur is broken, for example, in the animal kingdom, if an animal's femur is broken, the animal is left completely exposed. It is unable to access water or hunt for food. It is considered vulnerable to predators, so it often ends as the prey to the predators. And no creature on its own survives a broken leg in the wild. While the sign of a fractured but healed femur is the sign that when a human being was injured, was broken, and could not take care of themselves, there was somebody who took care of them, who stayed with them without exposing them to the dangers, and enabled the healing process to take place. And she said this is the oldest sign of civilization: solidarity, compassion, which stays with the weak and the vulnerable till the very end, ensuring that healing and restoration becomes the way of life rather than wounding other or violating the other. Because she says that the healed femur femur is evidence that another one has taken the time to stay with the fallen. That somebody has not just exposed themselves to risk, but have also not counted the cost, but have sustained their efforts. So solidarity is about being present through compassion and care so that peace can be nurtured. If we continue with the story of Bitya, next. She is somebody who has a profound influence on Moses' life because she is the one who gives Moses his name. So in the biblical tradition, naming is an important thing, as you may have understood. But in the Bible, Moses is the only name that is actually given by somebody who is outside that ethnic group. It is a name which is given by somebody who is an Egyptian. It is not a name given by God, and therefore she is somebody who has significant impact in Moses' life. And also, in some ways, her influence on Moses is something that cannot be ignored. Because you see, there are times when Moses stands up for the oppressed. There are times when he sees somebody hurting somebody else, he stands up and questions him. And some people say that it is because of the nurture that he received from Bitya, that he grew up with her, that she learnt this from Bitya. Next. And therefore, Bitya deserves a special recognition as we speak about shunning violence and nurturing peace. Next. Her influence on Moses is something that can also influence us and inspires us. Bitya teaches us something very important. Next. She teaches us that in context of violence and in context of injustice, we are called not to simply bandage the wounds of the victims beneath the wheels of injustice, but we are actually called to drive a spoke into the wheels of injustice itself, because the wheels of injustice cannot run. And this is a quote that is attributed to the famous German Lutheran theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who said that we are not as Christians called just to bandage the wounds of the victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We think our response is often only not addressing the violence, but treating the violated, which is important. But we are probably also called in today's world, shunning violence is a call to drive a spoke into the wheels of injustice, into the wheels of violence itself. So today as we leave, I want us to reflect on this one question. How do we understand Christ's mission as ushering in change in a broken world by not just trying to bandage the victims under the wheel, but to put a spoke in the wheel itself? How are we going to take inspiration from the various Bityas among us who are enacting prophetic and radical solidarity in our midst? How are we going to take inspiration from them to look out for the weak and the vulnerable, and while doing that, putting a spokes into the wheels of injustice? May Jesus Christ, the risen Lord, who's put a wheel into the spokes of imperial violence, inspire us and lead us so that we can not just be people who hear the word, but people who are doers of the word. Amen.
Thank you, sir, for this highly informative, intuitive, and awe-inspiring address. So you have touched various aspects on the paradox of religion, the sin of neutrality, and the distortion of history, and the aspects of nationalism, and the unholy alliance between economy and xenophobia, and weaponizing instruments of life into means of death, and Bitya's action of compassion and being present through the compassion and care. And also you touched on how Bithya's prophetic act had a profound influence on Moses' life. And thank you, sir, for placing your address in a wider context of the surging nationalism, violence, and injustice, and the systemic oppression, and culminating on the exemplary prophetic action and what we could learn from the acts of Bithya, or Shiro, the daughter of Pharaoh. Thank you, sir, once again. And having said this, now we move into the Q&A session of this session of the retreat. And if any of you would like to clarify any doubts, would like to ask any questions to the speaker, please feel to do so. And the floor is open for questions.
Good morning, sir. Thank you for your provoking message that you have delivered in the last two sessions. Greatly,
Just a minute.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your provoking and profoundly challenging session that you really moved us, and we are blessed and fortunate to have you as the guest speaker of this session. Sir, I do have a question. In the beginning itself, you began with emphasizing the need of the indispensability of the prophetic vocation of the church, that church leaders and political leaders should resist the sin of silence. When we look at the Indian context, as you rightly pointed out, the minority communities turns out to be the vulnerable victims in the hands of the Buddha fundamentalists. Horrible practices of intimidation, lynching, and routing to the worship place is a day-to-day activity in the nation today. That is the status reality in our country. But on the other hand, when we speak from my own context, that is Kerala, that where Christian community have a seminal role in the decision-making process in the state, the process of appeasement is working out. That the religious leaders are appeased by the Hindu forces. On the other hand, on the one hand, the religious minorities are threatened, and on the other hand, the religious minorities are appeased. So, the incidents in the recent past has reduced Christianity in the country to a position of insecurity and put its followers on the defensive. And this insecurity is heightened by the phenomenal growth of conformity by the church leaders to the ruling regime in the country. So, in such a paradoxical context, how dialogue would become an ecumenical solution for this problem? Thank you.
So we'll have the questions first, and we'll have sir answer all of them one by one. Next question, please.
Good morning, sir. My name is Yeshu, and I am pursuing my master's here.
You don't have to call me sir, you can call me Peniel. I have a name. So,
Peniel. Thank you for this wonderful sessions that you have blessed us with. As rightly pointed out by Brother Jerry, it's very intuitive and intellectual and in-depth that you have brought us through your reflections. My first question would be, I don't know, I just want to reflect from the last sessions when I went back to the my space, and then I was referring to your words, and I was sharing with one friend. Unfortunately, he's sick now. Somewhere in your sermon, you have mentioned about Noah, Jonah, paying the fare, something that you have mentioned. Is it the entirety of the ship that he has brought, or when we read the text, it generally gives us the understanding that he has paid a fare. The second question that I have related to today's reflection is that by portraying Vidya prophetic resistance that we are looking at, are we moving towards reading Exodus 2 as an example of divinely sanctioned God's obedience? For example, if in particularly, where how do we hermeneutically need principles for the church to determine when obedience to God needs or necessitates the disobedience of civil authority. So we are talking about something that is embedded, the injustice that is embedded in the political system legally. So in order to have an obedient, like we are somewhere looking at the Vidya's life, we are looking for a disobedience to look at the purpose of God as obedience. So just for the understanding.
Thank you for the question, brother. The next question, please.
Thank you, Dr. Peniel, for this very amazing
Hello.
session. And I have two. It's not a question per se because
Hello.
I like to base myself in that zone where I see it as a zone, right? But it's more of a struggle
Hello.
which the session actually is triggered. So the first, I have two points to share. One, the whole struggle of placing the church in today's context, and to be very specific from the context where I come from, Indian context, and also the recent, I'm from Tamil Nadu, so the recent political change of leadership has really disturbed me, and also has kind of, because we have, and if I have to say, we have an actor who does not have much of experience in the political background. We have assumed the leadership, the chief minister of Tamil Nadu. So from that particular context, the whole understanding of where the church has to be located in today's context is the other the villain, because I also unfortunately see shades of empire language or the whole missionary operating even within the church. There are also times where the church speaks the language of the empire, so who's the other here? So that's one. The second struggle is 10 decades before. If somebody told me there is a Shiro from the Bible, it would have definitely have pushed me, must have been very encouraging. But today, in today's context, the whole struggle of saying that somewhere in the presentation, it begins from home. Influence begins from home. So I think that was the symbol that was presented. So for me, that becomes a bit of a struggle, a bit problematic, because even Indian homes, it conveniently makes the women responsible for any kind of resistance or any kind of changes that has to take up, and put the men,
Hello.
with all respect to all men who also share the responsibility at home, particularly, but there's this common understanding pertaining to Indian households where men take passive role and the load is on the women. So how exactly to understand Shiva in today's context, because also this whole perplexity, this whole dopamine rush, where men and women together are caught up in this whole, where boundaries are enmeshed, where our roles are all overlapping, and we are also trying to progress at the same time. The whole understanding of women's rights, not as a pass, but as a purpose. It cannot be used as a pass saying that I am a woman, so I need a seat. I need a woman, so I need to have a quick entrance into positions. Or I need a woman, so I need a posture. So instead of saying that and trying to understand it as more of a purpose, I think that's a struggle because. Thank you for the session.
Please also want to
Mic here, please. We have one question here.
Good morning, Dr. Peniel. So my name is Victor. I am studying BD final year. So my question is regarding in the beginning of your session you spoke about the shunning violence, and you have quoted where our own faith and theology also can be a software of hate. So before going to the community and all, it is more important for the human self, for oneself to be motivated, whether positive or in a negative way. So as far as which one is more important, while in a positive thinking there are two ways of constantly thinking which is positive or constantly thinking which is good, or defending ourselves from the violence. So when it comes to the defending of ourselves from the violence, there are always thoughts of violence and how to defend that, and we are in that space. And for constant thinking it is different, where we set out of that mood and we come into a new space and we travel further. So from where we can expect the ample amount of result of being a peaceful world or a peaceful individual at first. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Can you say that last sentence again?
So I mean, there are two ways in a positive thinking.
Just the last.
So I mean, in which way can we expect an ample amount of result of being a peaceful individual for fostering a peaceful world?
Thank you, brother. Any more questions? And if there are no questions, I'd like to invite our speaker to answer all the questions that's been posed in this session.
Thank you for these questions. I'm really glad that we are having this moment of conversation. So let's start with Kerala. I think there's a question about minority appeasement and how, in that context, what might be an appropriate prophetic response. I think one of the things is we need to understand that the empire has got many tools in its toolkit. It tries different ways. Sometimes it is overt violence and intimidation. Sometimes it is much more covert, and it can be co-option, making others feel as if they are part of something which is bigger. And sometimes we also have this phenomenon of the benevolent oppressor. The oppressor is still an oppressor, but then comes across as being this benevolent oppressor that we can identify with, that seems to be supporting your cause. And very often these small wins only contribute to the big win of the empire. So in that context, I think the challenge for us as theologians is to, in some ways, do theology or think theology with our feet. Think theology with our feet rooted on the ground. What is the ground reality? What is the critical lens that I need to bring that is shaped by what is happening in the lives of the ones who are most vulnerable? Always have the most vulnerable as your point of reference. Doing theology cerebrally would mean that we just think peripherally, but when we bring in the lens of people's experience, I think that can be something that is truly prophetic. Because we need to realize that in the context of empire, as Jörg Rieger says, we will continue to support empire by default unless we pay attention to the marginalized spaces where we encounter difference and transformation. Always do theology, think theology with your feet firmly planted on the ground, in solidarity with the downtrodden communities. And then it will help you to see whether what is being played out is co-option or whether this is genuine solidarity. The second question about Jonah, yes, I think some interpreters, you may have your own interpretation, say that the biblical interpretation of Jonah paying her fare, in that, in the passing, in the Hebrew phrase, is considered to be the whole ship. It says that Jonah was in such a hurry and he wanted to get away from what God had called him to do in Nineveh, that he actually went to the shore, found the ship, did all that was necessary for him to get on the ship and for the ship to start without waiting for anyone. So there is one stream of interpretation that he prayed entirely. And then you also had this idea of the Exodus of how do we look at disobedience, especially in a context, or do we consider disobedience as something that is from God? Some of you may have heard this saying that when injustice becomes reality, rebellion becomes duty, right? When injustice becomes reality, rebellion becomes duty. And that is something that we have seen across history. For example, the rich history of civil disobedience, even in India, at the height of the British Empire, is one way of saying that we will shun violence, but will still resist. And disobedience is, as long as we can discern whether this disobedience is obedience and alignment with God's will, and it is not something that we are doing for the sake of our own heroism, for the sake of boosting our own charisma, as long as we are convinced that there is a cause that is bigger than us, and this is a cause for justice, I think there is a room for dissent, there is a room for disobedience, especially in resistance to injustices. And that protest tradition is something that has to be celebrated. And this protest tradition is also something that has led to transformation. So as long as it is not for a self-serving agenda, as long as the agenda is bigger than us, and as long as this agenda is for the nurturing of life, for the flourishing of all life, then resistance to the powers that be is a Christian responsibility. The whole, where has the church to be located? And we all know that the church is the community, the gathered community of the sinned against in many places. When the church started out, it started out under the shadows of the empire. It started out as communities of resistance that met in people's houses, where there was fellowship in the breaking of the bread, but there was also a radical call for a new way of living. People, what did the early Christian communities do? They held all the property, all the wealth in common, so that it could actually be of benefit to the entire community. A way of living that was countercultural to the ways of the living of the empire, which taught you to hoard wealth, to gain in your own power, in your wealth, in your own position. Rather than that, they resisted this way of living and embraced something that involved both the sharing of food, fellowship, but also resources. So the church is always the church can only be church in community. The church can only be church in solidarity. And this solidarity is a solidarity that has to be lived with the most marginalized, with the most vulnerable. And without that, we cannot embody the Christian faith at all. Somebody once said that a faith that does not do justice is not true faith at all. A faith that does not do justice, a faith that does not do peace, is no Christian faith at all. The last point about Shiro and about how we discern the role of allyship, the fostering of solidarity. Very often, in context of marginalization, in context of oppression, in context of injustice, the onus or the responsibility is placed on the people who are suffering to be those who will fight for themselves, right? And in some ways, if you look at the biblical story also, what the Hebrew midwives did was they were protecting their own people. But what Bithia did was she was fighting for somebody else, and she was embodying an allyship that went against her own position, her own protection, her own privilege. And that is sometimes the allyship that we are called to. That we are called to an allyship that converts, first of all, changes myself. Sometimes we can say, okay, I am in solidarity with all the marginalized people. But then we are in solidarity only as long as our own position and privilege are protected. As a man, I can claim that I am in solidarity with women. But this solidarity can sometimes become an arm's length solidarity. As long as my position as a man is protected, as long as my privilege is protected, and as long as I can still claim that I am an ally with women and women's causes, it's all okay. But that is not solidarity. Solidarity is also shrinking my own space, giving up space, so that becoming self-critical, so that I repent of my complicity. Not because I am abusive towards women or anything, but just recognizing that as a man, I automatically stand to gain from the privileges of a patriarchal society. Just because I am a man, I benefit. I don't have to do anything to benefit from a patriarchal system. And then to repent for my benefiting from that system is also part of allyship. Allyship, solidarity become meaningful only if it touches my very core. Only it calls me to the undoing of myself, the undoing of my power, the undoing of my privileges. Otherwise, it can just become a cosmetic exercise that I can even use. I can claim to be a feminist. I can claim to be somebody who is against patriarchy, as long as it doesn't affect my power and privileges. So solidarity is about giving up something so that a just community, an equal community of discipleship, what some feminist theologians have called God's kingdom, KNDOM, where everybody are siblings to each other, is actually fostered. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for patiently answering